Hello everybody, really nice to be here. We're small in number, but we are the best. It's kind of strange to be speaking right at the very beginning of the conference. I wouldn't be arrogant to suggest I'm going to try and set a theme for the rest of the conference, but maybe I'll set a question running by the end of what I managed to do today. What I'm going to talk about, and I've slightly changed the title, is I'm talking about specialist audiences. And the reason I've chosen the word specialist, because what I want to suggest is I'm talking about us. I'm talking about people who come with particularly committed professional interests in the film. What it arises from, this presentation, is, as you were saying, thank you, is the Alien Memories Project. This was, as you can see, conducted in about 2013. It was quite big, it wasn't huge, 1,125 responses. We know that we didn't recruit a full sample, because if you go on places like IMDb and look at the range of responses, the number of women who've watched Alien is not quite the same as the number of men, but it's much, much closer. Therefore, we got an unbalanced recruitment. How and why that is, I'm not sure. One thing that's very important is that we were using a kind of questionnaire, which I'll talk about in detail in a moment, which combines quantitative and qualitative questions. And the normal thing is, when we ask people, how did you originally rate the film? You'd say, excellent through to awful. We knew we wouldn't get any awfuls. It just was pointless. And therefore we skewed the ratio by putting at the top the heading masterpiece. And actually that turned out to be very, very productive. But you can see that even with that extension, we're getting 4.1 out of 5 overall evaluation. The film is widely regarded as beyond excellent, as being a qualitative mark in film history. That's really important. The reason we conducted the project started with the fact that in film studies, Alien held a very special place. But it was an argued place. And I want to tell one story. Quite a few years ago, when I was in Aberystwyth, I proposed a project to the AHRC to look at the record of the history of responses to Alien and how these accorded with or didn't accord with generalised audience responses. And I can honestly say it was one of the best research proposals I ever wrote up. It's still one I'm very proud of. And you can guess the outcome: we didn't get the money. Okay, you accept that. You just say, oh, well, worth a try. I still think it was a very good project, but what really knocked me was one of the critiques that we got from our respondents, our reviewers. One of the people said in his or her response to us, why would anybody be interested in the audiences for Alien? Now, given this huge literature there's been, 128 academic commentaries we found, again and again we found talk about the audience, as though it was a known, given, derivable thing from examination of the text. And we know very well that simply whenever you look around, there are always varieties of audience responses. That knocked me. And therefore, some years later, having got to know Kate Egan very well and worked with her, getting to know Tom Phillips when I was spending time in Norwich, working there as well, and Sarah Ralph, who was an ex-PhD student of mine, we decided we would do it on a self-funded basis. And we put in a bit of money each in order to create the website to do the research. So it's an act of revenge, in a way, doing this project. But it's quite interesting seeing Tom Schoen, who is a rather snarky film journalist. Why are academics so obsessed with Ridley Scott's movie and its sequels? And he only knew about 30 of the references. So what did we do in the project? We designed an online questionnaire, which some of you may know about. And by the way, I should just say now, how many people here filled in our questionnaire? 1. Okay, you're going to have to watch out just in case any quotes from you turn up in the course of this talk. And if you want to raise your hand and say, I'm sorry, you can. What we asked? We asked 2 kinds of questions. This set were ones that were quantitative in nature. You can see they range from age and sex, so their demographic features, through to things where we were offering people a list of options asking people to put themselves into a category that they felt best applied to themselves. So a series of ways in which we could sort our responses into patterns. And then alongside those, we asked them a series of questions which were open-ended, asking people to discourse with us. And it's one of those questions that's led me into what I'm going to talk about today. This question: what kind of viewer would you class yourself as? We gave people 6 options, like this: casual or occasional film viewer, film fan, film student or scholar, particular kinds of genres, interesting new releases, film expert or professional. Nobody seems to complain about this. I mean, we did get a number of emails afterwards from people saying, wow, I enjoyed filling in your questionnaire. And it seems that these 6 options allowed everybody to feel that they could allocate themselves reasonably fairly. And I'm interested in 2 of those. Come on, you beast. Thank you. The 192 who said they were film student or scholar, and the 97 who said they were experts or professionals. Now, I have to say, looking at the ages, what we discovered was that the film students and scholars were not predominantly young people. They were people 40s, 50s and above. Not quite my age, we'll let that go. So what I'm going to do is to talk about what I found when I started going back into the database and having a look to see what this revealed. And I have to say, when you do this kind of research, you always wonder as you first click into your search terms, am I going to find anything interesting at all? Oh boy, did I. Because what I want to point you to is, oh sorry, I meant to put this up. Because if I'm right about this, those 2 categories ought to encompass most people who are here at this conference. I think so. If I'm wrong, if people are here as film fans, and that's fine, but I'm focusing on the experts and professionals and the students and scholars. But I did find some really quite fascinating starter patterns. So I want to introduce you to 3 dimensions that we found within the research that really, really struck me as very interesting. The first one was this: the experts and professionals have seen the film many, many more times than the film students and scholars. 60.8 choosing 10 times and more, compared to only 12.7 for the students and scholars. That's a big difference. Second thing, their ratings of the film were substantially different. Experts and professionals, 41% masterpiece, only 24%, which was actually the lowest of all the categories from the students and scholars. So you were high to low on both dimensions. In light of that, you might expect that the experts and professionals, having seen the film so many times, having loved it so much and being devoted to it, would have an awful lot to say about it. Oh no. When therefore I did simple word counts of how long are the answers by comparison with each other, less than half as much to say from the experts and professionals compared to the students and scholars. What does this mean? Does it just mean that film students and scholars are gobby buggers who can't shut up? Or is there something about the nature of the way in which they're responding that requires them to say an awful lot? To give an illustration of just how much this difference shows, matching chance samples of 50 kinds of talk. One of the questions was, what's your view of Ripley? What's your view of the alien? What's your views on the false ending? Have your views changed over time? And is there anything about this film which is beyond entertainment? And you can see that on all these, the blues, the students and scholars, are way, way outstripping just the amount that they want to say. There was only one measure on which the experts and professionals began to catch up, and it was this one. What is the most remembered thing about the film? There is something interesting about that, because it suggests that that's where they felt most comfortable making lengthy answers. So let's then illustrate straight away with some kinds of answers. We'll start with a straight comparison of some of the short answers and think what they show to us, and the longer answers of the students and scholars. Here's answers to our questions. Have your views changed? Here's the experts and professionals. Typical short answers. Not really. I still love it. Not greatly, although now all those British actors like Ian Holm and John Hurt are the granddaddies of British quality. I think it gets better and better with each viewing. Still love it. It only gets better with age and more times that I watch it. Now, in some ways, these are terribly simple, unsophisticated answers. You think, what purport on earth can I lose from it? Let me suggest some of the things that we can learn from these very short answers. First of all, everything is measured against the first viewing. It's a question of enjoyment and quality and the relationship between them. It's a question of re-watching as an act of rediscovery of the pleasures you had last time. And each viewing is a separate encounter. In other words, you don't build up a history of saying, how did I remember it last time? It's each time starts again. Now compare that with a typical longer answer from the students and scholars. I remember not being scared by it, more unsettled. Viewings that since, I have a greater feeling of fear watching it, and the body horror elements still stuck with me. The alien eggs, throbbing, stick, turns my stomach. Rewatching it before Prometheus did make me see it more as a horror film. And the use of gender and the sexualised designs of Geiger were known by me when I first watched it, but were lost by me. As an adult, it's easier to see how the roles are played with and distorted and disfigured. Can you see what I mean about the differences here? There is a way in which viewings have accumulated and built on each other and revised backwards. You look back down the chain of your viewings to say, what was I like then? What does this say about me? It isn't just about the film as an entity to be checked and say, oh yeah, it's still as good as I remember. It is now about me growing in my relationship towards this film. There is something quite starkly different about the film experts compared to the film scholars. This then led me to look at something we asked all the audiences, which was how they would label the film. This is what we called our vernacular categories question. We said to them, here's a list of terms that might apply to it. Can you tell me which ones would you most likely choose? Up to 3. We have 3, in terms of frequency of response, we have 3 categories. First that came up, just about everybody chose science fiction and horror. There was pretty much no disagreement. More than 80 to 90% in all cases chose these. So, in a sense, they're unproblematic categories. There was then a middle group, which quite a number of people changed, but there was a variety. Must-see film, Ridley Scott movie, thriller, cult film, monster movie, Sigourney Weaver film. Spreads. And then there were just a small number at the end, which only a few chose. Action movie, slasher, woman's film, and political allegory. Now, in the formation of our database, we were able to look and see, film scholars, which among these were they more likely or less likely to choose? Film experts and professionals, which ones among these were they more or less likely to choose? So, using the colour coding, the students and scholars are in blue, and the experts and professionals are in red. Let's see which way more were chosen by each side. The experts and professionals emphasise its must-see quality and emphasise its Ridley Scott quality, but not its Sigourney Weaver quality. Whereas and they also choose monster. Film students and scholars emphasise Sigourney Weaver, slasher, and in particular the expression was slasher in space, and they emphasise its political allegoric qualities. They pull apart, in a strange way, in the way in which they want to make sense of this and label it as a kind of film. So let's have a look at and illustrate this then in the way this works out in particular answers. First of all, in answer to our question, is there anything about you in particular that would help us understand your answers? Here's an expert. Ray Scott. He's made some great films. I know auteur theory is deeply suspect, but if it has his name attached, I'll go and see it. I wouldn't have known Alien was a Scott film when I saw it when it first came out, but having become aware of his oeuvre since, it puts it into a particular category of quality and thoughtfulness. Quality and thoughtfulness. Oh, it's Scott! I mean, I know this academic theory, and it's interesting it's an academic theory, but that's not the point. It's quality and thoughtfulness. Now compare that with something using the same terms, but in a different way. I am an auteur structuralist, so always associate films with directors. Anyone interested in Ridley Scott or major film Hollywood auteurs or British filmmakers working in America should see Alien, along with Blade Runner, Thelma and Louise, and Gladiator. And I can tell you, because I've got the knowledge. This wasn't you, was it? Oh, thank God for that. There is a way in which knowledge is being put on display here. Here is someone saying, I'm a different kind of expert. I'm someone who knows my theory and knows how theory works. What about people's memories? What do you most remember about the film? Here are two answers. Student scholar first. First time I saw it, I was very young and simply enjoyed the visceral aspects of it, like an emotional roller coaster. Later, I appreciated political aspects as company employees are coerced into investigating this horrible creature. The company has its own motivations, has no concern for crew safety. This was a harsh reality for me as I was 10 when the film came out. Lastly, I've read a few things how it was supposed to be a story about women's reproductive rights, and some of that makes sense too. If men could get pregnant, there'd be drive-through abortion clinics. It's a lovely quotation, really nice, very thoughtful. That wasn't you, was it? No. Just checking. I won't do it anymore. But again, there's that sense in this answer that there is someone reaching outside for external criteria. It's things they've learnt along the way that they feel now they need to bring into the relationship to the film as they form their own later judgment. Now have a look at how an expert stroke professional does it. Much shorter again. I think it may have influenced my feelings about pregnancy, or it serves as a good metaphor to illustrate my feelings about pregnancy. Either way, in my head, there are strong linkages. Much, much more personalised. Much more about me as an individual finding something in that film and keeping going back to it to check that it's still there. Again, markedly different. Let's have a look then about another thing about the most memorable aspects of the film. Here's the student to scholar. Probably the sequence where Ripley undresses in the escaping ship is one that I discuss most frequently with my students. Notice again, this is about taking part in a public conversation about the film, and that's an important feature. I find Ash's attempt to suffocate Ripley with the rolled-up porn magazine particularly disturbing, and have often speculated the resonance this sequence might have had for feminists at the time in relation to debates about pornography. A thoughtful, outgoing relationship in which other people are the measure of what I ought to be thinking about it. Now compare that with the response of someone else also talking about the same moment in the film. Tough one. I think I'll go with the thinness of Ripley's panties. I was a pubescent boy at the time. I had no choice in the matter. And there is a different kind of whole relationship implied here about what it means to be an engaged audience with this film. Our categories really were working. Have your views changed? I'm coming towards the end. Student or scholar? My view is probably the same, that it's a great horror film in space rather than sci-fi, and I appreciate the film more now. That's probably due to listening to commentaries and seeing documentaries on the production process, being able to see more detail in each generation of home video hardware, that kind of thing. It also helps that since then I've seen a lot of films or video games trying to do the same idea without being able to pull it off quite as well. So there is an acknowledgement of quality in there. That is a feature of it. In other words, quality is important, but it's not the overriding factor. It's the factor that here is a film which is in discourse with its cultural environment in complicated ways. Compare that then. Well, it used to be a monster movie. Now I see it as a paranoia thriller about the nature of man and our innate fear of biological invasion. Universal themes now being expressed and held for the experts and professionals. So I want to summarise it then into a series of oppositions. I don't want to exaggerate these. These are tentative, there are overlaps, but something is clearly pulling these apart. Tentative comparison then between the students and scholars and the experts and professionals. On the one hand, the students and scholars look at the film in order to look back at themselves, in order to look outside, in order to hear the debates, in order to go back to the film, but end up making much, much more qualified critical judgments on the film. They are not as sure now that it is as good as they once thought it was. They're all the time learning what it means to be a proper audience for the film. They don't know until they've heard other people's views. Therefore, they're looking for external criteria. They're thinking, how do you make quality judgments on a film? And they go back to the film to check each time. So the film then becomes something to be weighed for its relationship to culture. And culture changes. Whereas the experts and professionals are much more comfortable with the idea of saying, I recognise quality when I see it. It's something maybe a little bit ineffable, but it's there and I feel it in my gut as I watch a film. So they have no problems with quality judgments. They go back to the film many, many more times to say, oh, it's every bit as good as I remember. It's still a wonderful thing. It's like re-looking at a classic painting. Yeah, look at it, celebrate it, put it on your walls, put it on your mantelpiece, put it on your DVD shelf, watch it again. The film is a culmination. So that it's a case of not the judgments on the film being so important, as the way the judgments are arrived at. Let me notice then one way, finally, in which they coincide. And it's something to do with a change. I said it early on in my talk that there had been at least 128 published commentaries on the film within the academic world. What I've noticed is there has been an almost complete stop in such commentaries in the last few years. It's almost as though the motives that were driving all those things have come to an end. And I've come to believe that one of the most important reasons for that is that in the 80s and the 90s, there was a worry about whether we were allowed to enjoy it. And it was captured for me particularly by one book. Come on. Isabel Pinedo's book, Recreational Terror. Really fascinating book, in which Isabel writes first and foremost as a feminist who has been told again and again that she probably ought not to enjoy watching this, or at least not to be an unalloyed pleasure. And she then writes her book as a defence against the critique of the film. And that was certainly very much part of the kind of ambience of the 1980s in particular, when writing about Alien was at its height. What we see then is a decline in that ambivalence in recent years as people begin to be more comfortable about finding enjoyment in things that are seen as culturally complicated. So here's then two final closing comparative quotations. How have my views on the film changed? Here's the answers. Experts and professionals. It's changed drastically. That is, when I first saw it, I was so young, I didn't understand everything that happened. Now I'm 22, and I've studied Alien, not only for personal pleasure, but in college. It has had a profound effect on me, and has made the search for extraterrestrial intelligence a passion of mine. It was Alien that really made me want to be the person that I am today. A sense of saved up, stored up influence which becomes a personal driver. Now look at this. I probably had very little awareness of any way of thinking about films other than I really enjoyed that when I first saw it. Since then, I've read a lot of film criticism, studied cinema at university, made some films myself, so I have various different perceptions. I think it's a masterclass in filmmaking from a technical and affective perspective. I'm also particularly interested in sexual identities and cinema, in sexual identities and cinema, and to me, Alien is a massively queer film. It now arrives into a space where it's acceptable to have complex enjoyments. And thus, Alien emerges into the middle part of the 21st century, or the middle first part of the 21st century, as a different kind of film configuring itself again. What will be interesting is to see across the course of this conference how that kind of new thinking plays out. I'll stop there.
Okay, so our argument today is that while Alien may be the title that defines the film's series, the heart of this franchise is in fact aliens. This may sound like inconsequential fan debate, but we think there are some important implications here. The original Alien is the unquestionable favourite in academic opinions, but the franchise's position in popular culture is far more indebted to Aliens, and this is almost entirely, and perhaps disappointingly to some Alien fans, because of Alien's appeal to children. The focus of the paper, then, is to explain how and why an R-rated horror sci-fi film series became a child-oriented franchise, and why this led to an identity crisis in the early 1990s, which remains unresolved to this very day. Let's begin by contextualising the first film and its attempts at franchising the Alien brand. So Alien is very much a 70s film. It's gory, it's not afraid to be explicit about sexual innuendo, as was noted in Martin's responses in his paper, and it has a subplot about class politics. It was a film targeted at adults. But when we look at Alien's promotion, we also find some acknowledgement that this film could make money from children. The big thing to keep in mind here is that Star Wars had just become a hit, and the toy line for Star Wars was a massive and unexpected success. Star Wars is sci-fi. Alien is sci-fi. You can see what the executives were thinking. And so, we get an attempt to replicate the Star Wars template with paramedia. So as you can see here, we have, from Kenner Toys in 1979, the 18-inch posable Alien action figure with mechanically operated jaws, the Alien Blaster giant target set, and the Alien jigsaw puzzle, some of the merchandise that was released for the original film. But while Kenner gambled on an Alien paramedia line, it didn't work. The story goes that parents were upset about this 18-inch figure, that Kenner, the toy company, got cold feet and cancelled the rest of their proposed action figure range. But this isn't entirely true. In reality, the big chap, as he is affectionately known, just didn't sell. Remember that Alien was a restricted film, unlike Star Wars, which was rated PG, and this was in the days before home video. So there weren't many opportunities for kids to become immersed in the Alien world as they had with Star Wars, and therefore not many opportunities to make the merchandise a success. Now we know, of course, that kids did watch Alien circa 1979, but not in the kind of numbers to sustain this kind of paramedia. Which brings us to Aliens. As you can see, there was a lot of merchandise for Aliens. We have comic book series, we have handheld electronic games, we have arcade games, we have a plaster moulding model making kit, we have an action figure line, we have trading cards, we have various iterations. The thing to say here is that Hollywood was in a very different place in 1986 when Aliens was made, as were the other entertainment industries. And this was in part because American demographics were changing as part of the second baby boom, which happened in the 1980s. Fertility rates matched and eventually surpassed those of the 1950s, so by the late 80s, there were a lot more children and preteens participating in popular culture than there had been in the 70s. The idea of a franchise, that is, a brand which spans multiple interconnected media, really took hold in the 80s, in great part because child consumers sustained these multiple media, even when the film that originated them was not an obvious family choice. See, for example, these famous 80s and 90s franchises. Commando, RoboCop, and Rambo are not really children's films, especially with that R rating, but our point is that their brand certainly was part of children's culture. Maybe it's the films that come to mind when we think of these franchises, but the brand's presence in culture was sustained by action figures, toys, video games, comic books, and animated series. And notably, these paramedia were not typically produced to coincide with the cinema release of the films. They came out in the years following, once the texts had reached children through television and home video. The action genre and its stars is another important factor here. Action is inherently child-friendly because of its tropes of adventure and straightforward morality, which are also used in comic books. And of course, stars like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone, as well as wrestlers like Hulk Hogan, had immense appeal with the younger crowd. And Aliens is a product of this culture. We see it in the text itself. There's the obvious change in genre from sci-fi horror towards action, but also the way it tones down the content to make it sort of family-friendly. There is less explicit gore than in the first film, thanks to the spectacle of guns and some editing magic, and the action revolves around the Marines and their banter, with parallels to child-oriented franchises like G.I. Joe. They even did the Spielberg thing of setting up a family unit at its core, including a child, Newt, as one of the main characters. And of course, it was directed by James Cameron, one of the principal architects of this new kind of 80s action cinema, who created The Terminator and co-wrote RoboCop 2. Let's look also at the merchandise and paramedia. As we can see from this timeline, Aliens paramedia, like that of other action films of the 1980s, explodes after the film's video release and television broadcast. So in 1989, you have the CBS television premiere of Aliens in the United States, and this is a significant moment. The film is edited slightly for home release, removing some of the language, but notably not too much of the violence, as well as some extra scenes which are reinserted to the film. Then in 1989, hot on the heels of the network television premiere, comes the first issue of the long-running Aliens comic book series. After that, in 1990, Konami released their immensely popular Aliens arcade game, which reimagines the film with a bright, gaudy, Saturday morning cartoon-esque aesthetic. And then in 1991, a further home video release for Aliens follows, this time reinserting some of the additional footage that was seen in the 1989 television broadcast, as well as extra director's cut content. Then, that same year, Kenner Toys began pitching Operation Aliens, a Saturday morning cartoon to Fox Kids as a tie-in for their planned action figure line. But this is where we start to see the problems raised by an expansion into other media, because Aliens came from Alien, and Alien was not at all like Rambo, Commando, or Robocop. Take a look at this quote from Margaret Loesch, one-time executive of Fox Kids, explaining why the Operation Aliens cartoon was ultimately nixed. Ken's prototypes were so creative, and we were all fans of the Aliens movie, so our interest was genuine, but the hurdles were just too high because it was an R-rated property. The other factor was that the Fox theatrical division did not want it turned into a children's property at this point in its life. Now, we know this comment about the R rating is an excuse because elsewhere in the franchise it didn't pose problems, and it wasn't an obstacle to brands like Robocop, Rambo, Conan, or Terminator. And indeed, just to hammer home that point, earlier that year, Fox Kids had produced a cartoon series based on the thoroughly R-rated Toxic Avenger series. The real reason is what she says next. They didn't want to turn it into a children's property, and particularly didn't want that to happen at this point in its life. So let's take a look at that timeline again. They cancelled the animated show because Alien 3 was coming out. Again, we need to point out here that Hollywood was in a different place in the 1990s to what it had been in the 1980s. And Filipa goes into a lot more detail about this in her book. But in a nutshell, the genres usually associated with the R rating, especially horror, started to rebel against child audiences. Alien 3 was a product of these new conflicts, and it ended up being one of the most protracted and difficult productions in cinema history as a result. The film was initially imagined as a straight sequel to Aliens. Famous sci-fi author William Gibson was brought in to write with an Aliens-esque brief that centred around the character of Corporal Hicks as the main character. But as the 80s turned to the 90s, the executives made a radical U-turn. They hired New Zealand art house director Vincent Ward to produce a gothic horror movie featuring Ripley and a xenomorph on a wooden planet inhabited by monks. Fox ultimately got cold feet about Ward's vision, fired him as director, and scaled back some of his wilder ideas. And the reason Ward gives for his dismissal is telling. By this stage, because the original Alien and Aliens had become very successful, everything was at risk. This was the franchise. This was the film that was going to keep the studio going. The risk here was that the film series was still the linchpin of each franchise and brand. If that failed, the toys, games, and all the rest would fail too. But just as the Aliens franchise was picking up speed, changes in Hollywood were making this model increasingly unworkable. And as we can see from the different kinds of scripts they entertained, producers were torn between two choices. Drop the first film's horror angle and fully embrace action with Aliens 2, or drop the Aliens tone and go back to the prestige of the first Alien. Both options were risky, as we see with other action franchises that went PG-13 in the 1990s, such as Robocop. The overt targeting of children completely alienated adult audiences. And this was in fact what happened later on with the Alien vs Predator movie spin-off. But moving so sharply away from the franchise's established child-friendly tone was a difficult thing to manage successfully. In the end, while Ward's more eccentric choices were nixed, they still decided to go for prestige and horror. Where Aliens had toned everything down, Alien 3 dialed it all back up. It's the horror genre again, with no guns, more gore, and sexual content. There's also a pseudo-historical setting with intellectual undertones throughout, which was very much part of the horror genre style in the 1990s. Just think Silence of the Lambs or Dracula. And significantly, there's no more families or children. Hicks and Newt die straight away, in various gory ways, with Newt's death in particular being emphasised during a prolonged autopsy scene. These choices make the film sure of its decision to move away from the child-friendly blockbuster 80s action template towards the more restricted and intellectual domain of horror. But the tortured production suggests a more complicated thought process. Just remember the number of drafts, writer and direct changes, and last-minute adjustments. But also note what the rest of the franchise did. We mentioned earlier that the animated show was cancelled so it wouldn't interfere with Alien 3's new brand. But the truth is, they couldn't escape that it was Aliens which established the franchise as such. So we end up with an interesting compromise and the emergence of Alien's split personality. While the film series course corrects towards maturity, the paratexts carry on promoting the more child-friendly Aliens. Alien 3 was adapted into a comic miniseries in 1992, but it flopped and has never been reprinted. After that miniseries, the comics returned to the Aliens universe, ignoring Alien 3 continuity and picking up with the continuing adventures of the Colonial Marines. The video games were more obvious still in their disregard for Alien 3. The home console game draws directly from Aliens, while the arcade game reimagines Alien 3 as Aliens 2, complete with Colonial Marines, hordes of xenomorphs, and maximum firepower. And it is significant to note that Aliens 3, the arcade game, was titled Alien 3 The Gun, something of which there is a conspicuous absence of in the Alien 3 film. The incompatibility between the film brand and the franchise brand becomes more apparent still as time goes on. And the films released after Alien 3 illustrate this. So Alien Resurrection tried to reconcile the two brands by attempting to repeat the mainstream action feel of Aliens, but it still overtly signalled its intention to reject child audiences as part of the franchise's demographic. There was the R rating, and of course, the prestige art film director Jean-Pierre Jeunet. Then, the Aliens vs Predator series takes a turn back to the Aliens tone. The first film in the franchise is the first film in the Alien series to be rated PG-13, but with mixed results. And once again, they attempt to course correct with Alien vs Predator Requiem, which goes for a hard R slasher angle and doesn't seem to win over any fans either. By the time Prometheus and Alien Covenant came along, there was an obvious desire to correct the mistakes of Alien vs Predator and an irreversible return to the seriousness and legitimacy of the first film. Ridley Scott was back in charge, and the films not only ignored but actively corrected many of the concepts introduced in Aliens, as well as the entire Alien vs Predator series. What is interesting, though, is that the fans have never really stopped wanting Aliens 2. There's the continued fascination with William Gibson's original script for the third film, the one which would act as a straight sequel to Aliens. And in this year alone, we have seen the release of a graphic novel adaptation of his script, the alternative Alien 3, and that in turn has just been adapted into an audio drama on Audible, which features Michael Biehn, the original choice of Hicks, reprising his role from the film for the audio drama. And of course, producers have toyed with the idea of a new Alien film, which would take place after Aliens and ignore the developments of Alien 3. In 2015, director Neil Blomkamp revealed that he was attached to the project, which was apparently then put on indefinite hiatus at the insistence of Ridley Scott. Something very telling, of course, about that continued split personality and the debates within the franchise. The explanation for Aliens' endurance is not simply nostalgia. It is that Aliens continued to be the franchise's core brand well after Alien 3 came out. Other than the obligatory movie tie-ins, the Alien franchise outside of the film series has remained almost exclusively focused on the Aliens brand, including the Aliens vs. Predator spin-offs, which include the Colonial Marines and are very much part of the Aliens universe. And as we can see here, you have the Aliens comic books, the Aliens Colonial Marines technical manual, Aliens Colonial Marines the video game, the Aliens novelizations, and of course the ubiquitous Aliens toy line, which continues to be almost exclusively focused on aliens and making pretty much every single character that appeared in that movie in plastic form. Our main point here is that the intensity of this brand splitting always needs to be kept in mind when we think about Alien, its significance and its legacy. More than the other brands of the period, Alien is a franchise which struggled deeply to negotiate a rapidly changing industrial landscape, as well as changing expectations of film genres and their legitimate audiences. Thank you very much.